Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this edition of the Westwood Lecture. This is started by my predecessor, Mitch Daniels, quite a few years back. And with great help from a team here, we're able to make it a regular feature of the intellectual life of this community of scholars. We have 4 per semester, so 1 per month, roughly. And today we have the grand finale for this semester. The 4th and last one for this semester of Westwood Lecture. We are wondering about a lot of the future for space science missions these days, right? And today we get to hear from our own EAPS colleague, Michelle Thompson, on a time machine, if I remember the title correctly, of the early solar system. At Purdue, we have an outstanding tradition and heritage on anything space-related, including crewed missions, but also science missions. Earlier this semester, actually, we listened to Roger about some of the Mars rover samples, and today we're going to listen to this analysis of another NASA mission and the sample return, or this is a NASA mission sample return.
Absolutely.
Okay. Based on that, what we can learn about the early solar system. As a community of open, curious minds, perhaps very few topics would rival the intellectual significance and depth as today's topic by our very own Michelle Thompson. Thank you so much.
Thank
Michelle.
you. Well, hello, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be here today, and I'm very excited to kind of take you on a journey that I've been on to Asteroid Bennu and back over the last few years of my career. And I want to start off, I like to start these talks off with kind of a bird's eye view of the research program that I have built here at Purdue. And I broadly categorize myself as a material scientist. I just happen to study materials that get returned from other planets to Earth. And when I think about the kinds of questions that you can ask when you are analyzing planetary materials, I separate them into 2 different themes. The first one is questions of origin. So what is the diversity of planetary bodies that we find in our solar system, and what types of processes or mechanisms led to the development of those bodies in the earliest days of our solar system's history? And I do a little bit of work in the origin question, but I've spent much more time thinking about questions of evolution. So how have these planetary bodies evolved over the last 4.5 billion years of the solar system, and how can we disentangle those evolutionary processes from what was going on to form these bodies in the first place? And I do this by studying a particular class of solar system body that we call an airless body. That means any planetary body that does not have an atmosphere. Here on Earth, we've got an atmosphere that's protecting us from the very harsh space environment, but there are a lot of planetary bodies in our solar system that do not have that level of protection. One of those you're all familiar with, that's the moon. And I've done a lot of work analyzing lunar samples, including those that have been brought back by proud Boilermakers from here at Purdue. But some that you might be less familiar with are in the class of near-Earth asteroids. That includes asteroid Itokawa, which was visited by a Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency mission called Hayabusa, as well as asteroid Ryugu, visited by JAXA mission Hayabusa 2. And what I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about today, asteroid Bennu, which was visited by NASA's OSIRIS-REx mission. This is NASA's first asteroid sample return mission. When I think about these questions of origin and evolution, I build my research program into 3 different pillars. The first one is by studying the return samples we have here in the laboratory. That includes samples that were brought back by humans through the space exploration program like Apollo, and also robotic missions like Hayabusa, Hayabusa 2, and what we'll talk about today, OSIRIS-REx. Now, we're not fortunate enough to have samples from every planetary body in the solar system, so sometimes I have to simulate these processes of origin and evolution of these planetary bodies using laboratory experiments and analog materials. And then I like to get involved in the missions themselves, which I'll spend a lot of time talking about today, planning the exploration targets, understanding how we are going to successfully select the right samples to bring back and analyze in the laboratory. So out of these 3 themes, I've spent a lot of time focused on understanding the evolution of planetary bodies across the history of the solar system. And one of those processes that I've spent most of my career on is something called space weathering. Space weathering is a process that occurs on the surfaces of these airless bodies, modifies the samples at the surface in the soil or the regolith of planetary bodies due to its exposure to the harsh interplanetary space environment. Now, it changes morphology of grains on the surface, it changes mineralogy, composition, microstructure, and all of those changes accumulate and influence what we can observe and analyze with our remote sensing or orbital spacecraft that go into orbit around these planetary bodies. Now, it's driven by two primary processes. The first are micrometeorite impacts. These are hypervelocity dust particles moving at many kilometers per second that are impacting grains on the surfaces of airless bodies. They cause the formation of unique grains called agglutinates. These are melted composites of mineral fragments with impact glass welding them together. They also melt and vaporize different phases on the surface and change the chemical composition of our soil on planetary bodies. The second is the interaction of surface material with energetic ions that are coming off the sun. This includes solar wind particles, which are predominantly hydrogen and helium, which is what the majority of the sun is made out of. And this also includes higher energy particles that are coming off the sun in unique events like solar flares. And the interaction of those energetic particles with the samples cause amorphization, which is the breakdown of crystal structure within the minerals on the surface of these planetary bodies. It also sputters particular elements and ions and develops vesicles or bubbles as a result of the accumulation of those solar wind species in the grain rim. So now we know what space weathering is, but how did we know that this process was occurring on the surfaces of planetary bodies across the solar system? We knew it because we brought samples back from the moon. Once those samples were returned by the Apollo astronauts, scientists got them in the laboratory and they started looking at how light interacted or reflected from the surfaces of those samples. So now you'll see plots of reflectance. This is just how much light is reflected back from the surface versus wavelength. And when they took a lunar soil sample that had been scooped up by Neil Armstrong and put into a bag and brought back to Earth, and they compared it to a lunar rock that they had collected and then pulverized and created this sort of artificial lunar soil, there were several significant differences between the way they interacted with light. The first one is that the lunar soil was much darker, meaning it had lower reflectance across the board compared to the ground-up lunar rock. The second one is that these characteristic absorption bands were attenuated, meaning they're absent in the lunar soil. And these absorption bands are very important because they give us clues as to what the minerals are on the surface of the planetary body, which we can use to tell what the composition is. The third difference we noticed in the lunar soil was that there was a change in the spectral slope, or how much reflectance we see at different wavelengths. And in the case of the moon, we see spectral reddening. That means you increase the reflectance with increasing wavelength compared to our ground-up lunar rock. So we knew that some process was occurring at the very surface level of soil on the lunar surface that we were not observing in the interiors of these lunar rocks. So knowing that this process is occurring, they started to look for the culprit. What is going on at the microstructural or the chemical level as a result of these space weathering processes? I'm going to walk you through the entire diversity of different products that we see as a result of space weathering, and this will also give you a good introduction to some of the images that we're going to see throughout the rest of the talk. First, we talked about agglutinate grains. This is just a visible light microscope image, and these are formed during micrometeorite impact events that are melting material and welding together mineral fragments with glass. And you can see that shiny, glassy material on the surface. At first, scientists thought, great, here's our culprit. They look really dark. Maybe this is what's driving space weathering. But they kept looking using the electron microscope, going to finer and finer scales. And the next thing they noticed was the presence of these vesiculated textures, or bubbles. The image second from the left on the top, you can see that there is this sort of hummocky surface texture that looks like there are bubbles underneath the surface of the grain. And then we can take a cross-section of that grain and look at it in the transmission electron microscope and see all of those bright circular features, which are accumulations of solar wind ions in these vesiculated textures. We also see the breakdown of crystal structure or amorphization. You're looking at a cross-section in the upper right corner where The dashed line represents an area that the crystal structure has been broken down by those ions bombarding the surface. If you look in the upper left of that image, you see these fine scale parallel lines. Those are representative of atomic and lattice planes within the crystal structure that are being broken by these irradiation processes. We also see the remnants of these energetic particles from solar flares, these crisscrossing lines of ionization damage that we see in the cross sections of the grains. We can actually use the density of those solar flare tracks to understand how long a sample has been sitting at the surface of a planetary body. Then we see the development of differences in chemistry at these outer rims, as well as the production of melt and vapor deposits, including droplet-like features on the surface, shown in those two images. And then we finally found the culprit. In lunar samples, there's the production of metallic iron nanoparticles, these really bright spots that you can see in the image in the lower right. And these metallic iron nanoparticles are what's driving the optical changes, causing the attenuation of those characteristic absorption bands, darkening the reflectance spectra, as well as causing slope reddening. So we can see this diversity of space weathering characteristics at the nanoscale, but we can also just see it at the macro scale. This is an example of a core sample collected on the Apollo 17 mission. So a core sample, you just stick a tube down into the soil on the surface of the moon. This was done by one of our Boilermakers, Gene Cernan. And so if you look at the right-hand side of the image, that represents the surface of the moon. You're going into the interior of the lunar soil going to the left. Everybody see how much darker it looks at the surface? That's a result of the accumulation of all of these different space weathering products. So now we know what space weathering is, we know how it manifests itself both at the nanoscale as well as at the macro scale, but what kinds of tools are we using here at Purdue to be able to analyze these characteristics? Most of the work today I'll show you is in the form of electron microscopy analyses. So if you've ever used a light microscope, maybe in biology class back in high school, it works on the same general principle. You've got a beam that is being focused by lenses to try and magnify the image. But for electron microscopy, instead of light, we're using a beam of electrons that is then accelerated towards the sample. In the case of transmission electron microscopy, we need to make that sample electron transparent. That means it has to be less than 100 nanometers in thickness. If you're not used to thinking in nanometers, that's 10 to the negative 9 meters. So these are very thin wafers of material that become transparent to the electron beam. And then based on the way those electrons interact with the material in the instrument, we can get different types of information. We can get images which show us about the structure. That's how we generated those nice images showing the lattice planes within our crystal structure. But we can also get chemical information that shows us the distribution and quantitative composition for these different samples using energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy like the map in the upper right. And we can understand how much energy is lost from the electron beam after it's transmitted through the sample to get an understanding of what types of light or volatile species might be present in the sample using a technique called electron energy loss spectroscopy, or EELS. So the electron microscope, and in particular the transmission electron microscope, is a really powerful tool to study these processes because it gives us information on chemistry and microstructure down to the atomic scale. So we know what kind of tools we're using, but why is it important to study space weathering? I'm here to indoctrinate you into my field. So the first reason is that we want to understand what processes are going on across the solar system that are causing their evolution over 4.5 billion year timescales. But we also need to understand what's driving these changes in order to accurately interpret any of the surface compositional or mineralogical data that we get from remote sensing spacecraft, any instrument that goes into orbit around a planetary body. We also want to be able to link the analysis of samples here in the laboratory to the characteristics of the planetary body from which they came from, and then really understand our return sample collection. What characteristics are a result of their formation processes that can tell us about early solar system conditions, and what is simply a result of these space weathering processes that have been happening over the last 4.5 billion years. So now we know why space weathering is important, but what do I want to talk to you about today? Up until this point, everything I've told you is in the framework of the moon. This is where we have gotten our most mass from a returned sample collection. We've also had these returned samples for the longest, so it's natural that we understand this process on the moon much better than other planetary bodies across the solar system. But today I want to explore, what about carbonaceous asteroids, a very specific type of asteroid within our solar system that's actually the most common in the main asteroid belt. Now, why is it important to study carbonaceous asteroids? Because asteroids themselves are very primitive building blocks of the early solar system. Studying these materials is like taking a time machine back 4.5 billion years. They have not been significantly altered in the way that the Earth has through the development of plate tectonics or volcanoes. These are really remnants of 4.5 billion years ago. And then carbonaceous asteroids in particular are very important because they contain organic molecules that were formed in these early solar system environments. So they can give us an inventory of what the organic building blocks of our solar system were. These organics could have been delivered to Earth early in its history and eventually evolved into life. So getting an understanding of what the diversity of those building blocks are is very important. So this is why NASA decided to target a carbonaceous asteroid for our next sample return mission. And Asteroid Bennu was selected as the target for the OSIRIS-REx mission in 2005. At the time when Bennu was selected, there were about 500,000 known asteroids in the solar system. As of yesterday, that number is almost 1.5 million. Among those asteroids, we needed to go to a planetary body that was going to be accessible, meaning we could get there in a reasonable amount of time and get those samples back to Earth. That took us down to only about 7,000 asteroids in near-Earth space, meaning they're between the orbits of Earth and Mars. Today, that number is about 37,000. So you can see how our detection of these asteroids has improved over the last 20 years. But not all of those asteroids are in optimal conditions for getting a spacecraft there and returning that sample. So that took us down to about 200 targets. We needed something large enough that we could safely identify an area on the surface that would be applicable or useful for getting a sample from. That took us down to 26. Then we wanted one that was carbon rich because we were interested in these organic building blocks. That took us to 5. And among those 5, Bennu was selected, mostly because we had slightly more data for Asteroid Bennu than we did for some of the other targets. And when I say slightly more data, I mean slightly. This on the right is the data that we had of Asteroid Bennu before the OSIRIS-REx mission launched. We knew what its spectral characterization was. That pointed us towards it having carbon-bearing species on the surface. We also had radar data from the Arecibo telescope in Puerto Rico that we could build a shape model from to get an understanding of what this asteroid might look like. But we really had no idea what to expect. So once OSIRIS-REx was selected, it was selected in 2016, which is the year that selected in 2011, which is the year that I started graduate school. And OSIRIS-REx is an acronym because any good NASA mission has to have an acronym or else it's not going to get funded. So it stands for Origin, Spectral Interpretation, Resource Identification, Security Regolith Explorer, and there will be a quiz at the end, so please memorize that. So after launch, or after selection in 2011, they spent about 5 years building the spacecraft, and it launched in 2016. Spent 2 years on its way to Asteroid Bennu, and then went into orbit for about 2 years to really thoroughly map the surface and identify the location that they wanted to collect the sample from. That sample collection was done in 2020, and then the samples were on their way back to Earth for a few years before landing here in 2023. So this is what the OSIRIS-REx spacecraft looked like. You can see some people in the clean room during its assembly. And the exciting thing about OSIRIS-REx is that we were bringing samples back into the laboratory. This is not something that NASA had ever done for an asteroid before, especially an asteroid that's not a huge planetary body. And the way that they did that was by developing a sample mechanism called TAG-SAM. That stands for Touch and Go Sample Acquisition Mechanism. And that is what you're looking at in the right-hand image. There's an arm that extended from the spacecraft with this sort of circular feature at the end. The spacecraft was never going to land on Bennu. It was just going to approach very gently, touch the surface with that TAG-SAM, and collect the sample before retreating from Asteroid Bennu. So they developed this in process with Lockheed Martin, and launched in 2016 and arrived at Bennu in 2018, and this is the view that we got. Bennu itself is about 500 meters in diameter, so you can see some of these boulders that are sticking off the surface are on, the size of cars. Some of them might be the size of small houses. And this is not what we had expected. From the shape model that we developed with that radar data, we thought it was going to be a beautiful fine-grained surface, really easy to collect a sample from, and instead we got extremely coarse-grained material, very rough and rocky on the surface, and it took a lot of work to identify safe locations to go and approach the surface of Bennu and collect a sample successfully. This is what that sample collection was meant to look like. Here's a nice video developed by Lockheed Martin. You have the tag SAM that's approaching the surface, that circular feature at the end of the arm. They thought, great, we'll just gently touch the surface. They were going to fire some compressed nitrogen to sort of fluidize that regolith and be able to suck it back into the tag SAM, and then retreat, very calmly away from the asteroid and stow that tag SAM in the sample return capsule for its eventual transit back to Earth. Here's what the sample collection actually looked like. Here's the tag SAM, that circular feature at the end of the arm, approaching the surface of Bennu. Very gentle, very, calm. Not so much. We'd expected the tag SAM to penetrate a couple of centimeters below the surface of the asteroid. It ended up going almost 50 centimeters below the surface. And you can see all of the material that was released from the surface during that sampling event. The spacecraft backed away from the asteroid successfully, and we actually didn't damage the spacecraft at all, which was great. But the next phase was to understand, okay, did we get sample? Was it a successful sampling attempt? Because we had an opportunity to go back and try it again, only one more time, if it wasn't successful. So we started using the cameras to image that tag SAM. This is that circular feature. And what we saw was this. There were particles, rock particles, that were leaking out of the tag SAM. The best that we could figure was that it was so full, so jam-packed full of material that there were rocks that were wedging the flap open and allowing material to escape. We were supposed to do some really complicated inertial measurements to try and understand what the mass was, but we said we're scrapping that, we're stowing it in the sample return capsule, and we're sending it back to Earth. So they tucked it into the sample return capsule, went seamlessly, and they closed the sample return capsule up and sent the spacecraft on its way back to Earth. The spacecraft itself did not land back on Earth. It actually is continuing on to analyze another asteroid, but it did release the sample return capsule on its way by flying by Earth. So you'll see here on the left, that's actually Earth. And you might see a shadow come from the right-hand side. That's the sample return capsule when it was released from the spacecraft on September 24th of 2023. Now, the sample return capsule was due to land in the Utah Test and Training Range. We were assisted by the United States military in recovering that. Now, this was another moment of terror because there were supposed to be 2 stages of parachutes that deployed as it re-entered Earth's atmosphere. The first parachute, which was supposed to stabilize the sample return capsule so that it wasn't tumbling as it came in, and then the second parachute, which you see here, which was just designed to slow it down and make a soft landing. The first parachute did not deploy. So the science team we knew when the call-outs were supposed to be happening for these different events, and we knew that this first parachute did not deploy. There was a solid 5 minutes where we thought we were going to spend the next 5 years of our life picking out tiny asteroid particles from the dirt in Utah, but thankfully, the main chute deployed much higher altitude than it should have, but it successfully landed those samples in Utah. And this is what the sample return capsule looked like after coming in through Earth's atmosphere. Reminder, this is what it looked like before its re-entry. It shouldn't have been quite that charbroiled, but because of that first parachute, it was just tumbling as it came in through the atmosphere and really getting, rotisserie grilled on all orientations. But it was successful, and we breathed a big sigh of relief. The samples were in Utah for all of about 12 hours before they were packed onto a military flight and flown to Houston, where the the samples were curated at NASA Johnson Space Center. Once we got them into the curation facility, we had to disassemble some of the sample return capsule, and then we lifted up the top cover to get our first reveal of what the tag SAM looked like. And this is what we saw. So this is a tag SAM. That's that nice circular feature that you saw that approached Bennu and collected the sample. But what you might notice is that there's all this black dirt that is spread across the avionics deck of the sample return capsule. You can see a nice oblique view in the upper right there. This is all Bennu material that leaked out of the tag SAM because we thought it was wedged open during that re-entry process. But in the intervening 3 years from when we collected the sample to when it landed back on Earth, we had some time to think, and we thought, well, this is a perfect opportunity. It's going to take weeks to disassemble the tag SAM, to get out of the witness plates, to undo all the bolts, but we'll have access to that immediately, all that dirt that might be laying on the avionics deck. So that's exactly what they did. They assembled a small group, a small team called the Tiger Team to analyze that material that was sitting on the avionics deck for the first 72 hours after the samples were available to us. So I was lucky enough to be one of these 6 team members that was working on these samples. I don't look happy at all. You can see the little Bennu samples there. But we spent 3 days trying to get an understanding of what Bennu was made of. And the purpose of this was kind of multifold. One, we wanted to be able to inform the science team on what the composition of the samples were so that they could better select their own materials. We also wanted to inform the press, and we wanted to tell NASA headquarters what success we had had with the mission. Ultimately, we got over 120 grams back from Asteroid Bennu, which was more than twice the mass that we had expected. For the next few slides, I'm going to talk about this tiny little Tiger Team sample. So the first thing we did was use X-ray techniques to kind of get an understanding of what the bulk mineralogy of the sample was. And we found that there were hydrated minerals, meaning minerals that have water as part of their crystal structure. These are really important because they can tell us about the distribution of water and other volatiles in the early solar system. We also saw sulfides and oxides, which the composition and their morphology, like those images you can see on the right, tell us a lot about their formation mechanism and what processes were going on Bennu's parent body early in solar system timescale. Now this was all very exciting, but it wasn't particularly surprising because we have meteorite samples that come from asteroids which have similar mineralogy to this, so it was expected. But what was incredibly surprising was that distributed throughout these really dark black rock samples were some that had this really bright crust or veins that were running through them, these sort of white minerals spread across the surface. And the composition of those minerals included phosphates, salt minerals, sulfates, carbonates, all of which represent an evaporation sequence that happened as minerals form out of a fluid on the surface of the parent body. That's exciting because it tells us about the composition of the fluid on the asteroid in the early solar system, but it's also important because it tells us there's a hospitable environment for the formation of things like prebiotic organic molecules. So our next move was to look for these organic species, and we used some techniques to try and understand what their distribution was. So this is a crushed grain from Bennu, and on the right, all of those areas that are lighting up like bright stars in the sky are concentrations of organic molecules. We can then take that grain and do some bulk organics analysis. What we found is that in Bennu, there's a high amount of bulk carbon and nitrogen. You can see Bennu in the upper right there, much more than any other return sample set or meteorite sample that we have in the laboratory. We also see really important components or precursors to organic life, including amino acids. We had 14 of the 20 amino acids that we see in terrestrial biology were detected in samples from Bennu, as well as nucleobases, which are important for building blocks of life. So all of that information in these first few days of sample analysis was giving us exciting information showing that asteroid Bennu could have been a factory that was building the precursors for life that could have been delivered to early Earth. The mineralogy of those evaporite sequences is telling us about the environment and it being hospitable. The amount of organic molecules is telling us that we have this really enriched composition, and then the diversity of those organics, including amino acids and nucleobases, could have been delivered by impacts to an early Earth environment and eventually evolved into life. I like to think of this as we didn't find life, but if you imagine life as like a cake, We found the flour and the sugar and the eggs, and we also have the oven. We just are missing the recipe for how to bake it. So if you're interested more in these questions of evolution, some of this work was published earlier this year in Nature, and it's a very exciting look at how this applies not only to Bennu, but to solar system bodies outside of near-Earth asteroids as well. But I wasn't brought on to talk about or to analyze these questions of origins. This was just kind of a side quest for me. Instead, I was brought on to try and understand how Bennu had evolved and how it was continually evolving through these space weathering processes. And one of the reasons they wanted to answer this question is because Bennu has a different color than a lot of other carbonaceous asteroids that we see in the main belt. You might be thinking, I saw that picture, it just looked gray. It does look gray, but when we talk about color, we're talking about how the light reflects at different wavelengths. So Bennu is actually much bluer compared to other carbonaceous asteroids. And the moon, if you remember when I talked about our spectral characteristics for space weathering on the moon, everything becomes redder. So why is Bennu getting blue? Is this because of some fundamental difference in its composition, or is it a result of these space weathering processes that are driving these spectral changes? So to investigate that, not only did we have the bulk sample that was collected in the TAGSAM, we did something pretty ingenious, which was to put these features called contact pads on the surface of the TAGSAM. So this is your TAGSAM now, but it's been flipped over. So this is the surface that was first in contact with with Asteroid Bennu. And we distributed 24 of these stainless steel Velcro pads across the surface of the TAGSAM. And the Velcro was meant to trap these very small surface level particles that is going to kind of concentrate our best chance at finding space weathered material from the asteroid. So you can see in the center image there, that's one of the contact pads after the samples have been returned. Some of those loops are broken. You might expect that from that very kind of violent interaction that we had with the asteroid. And we looked at these contact pads, and on the right, if you look in that circle, there's a particle that is trapped within the loops of that Velcro. So we were able to extract those particles from the Velcro, and importantly, we knew what their orientation was, meaning we could orient the samples in our analytical instruments like the electron microscope to expose the surface that we thought was sitting exposed at the surface of the asteroid as well. So the hunt was on for evidence of space weathering or surface exposure in these materials. And we started finding this evidence right away. These are now scanning electron microscope images. So you're looking at the surface of a particular grain. You might see a big hole sitting on the surface of this one with all these radial fractures that are emanating. This is a result of a high velocity dust impact that's creating a crater on the 10 to 20 micron scale on the surface of one of these particles. The center image shows you this kind of frothy melted texture of material within that crater. This is the melt that was developed as a result of that impact process. Now, using our techniques, we can pull a cross section of that impact crater to see how deep did the impactor go? And it turns out we couldn't even reach the bottom of that impact crater. On the right, you'll see this kind of track running diagonally through, and there's that bright sort of plate. That is an iron sulfide, kind of like a metallic plate that this impactor just punched its way right through. That tells us things about what the mechanical strength of that impactor could have been, how fast that impactor must have been moving, and can give us clues as to what the interplanetary dust population looks like that was interacting with the surface of Bennu. Now, this is a particularly exciting crater, but most of them aren't that huge. A lot of them are in the 1 to 2 micron range, so that's 10 to the negative 6 meters. And you can see the distribution of these microcraters spread across the surface of one of these grains. A couple of examples are in the center. They've got these raised rims. They look just like a smaller version of impact craters here on Earth. If any of you have been out to Arizona, you might have seen Meteor Crater, a beautifully preserved impact crater, and these have the exact same morphology, just many orders of magnitude smaller. And craters and their distribution on the surfaces of planetary bodies and planetary materials is a very important way that we can tell how old a surface is. So there's a crater frequency distribution plot that has been calibrated for the moon that tells us this is how long a sample surface was exposed on the surface of that planetary body. So for asteroid Bennu, the crater counts that we did across all of these individual particles got us exposure timescales somewhere between 13,000 and 67,000 years. So we're looking at tens of thousands of years this grain was sitting on the surface of the asteroid, exposed to the interplanetary space environment. Now, craters aren't the only characteristic we see resulting from these micrometeorite impacts. We also see melt deposits. This is the distribution of melts across that splashes across that same particle, and some examples are on the right. They have these very diverse morphologies, but there's a few things that are consistent between them. Each of these images is what we call a Z contrast image. That means elements that have a higher atomic number or further down the periodic table appear brighter in these images. And within each of those melts, you see these bright spots, these kind of stars in the night sky that are included within the melt deposit. These are our nanophases, just like we've seen in space-weathered lunar samples. So our next step, knowing that we've identified these nanophase particles, which can be very optically active, we wanted to figure out what their composition was. So we then take cross-sections of those melts going into the grain interior. Now we're looking at transmission electron microscopy images, so the surface of the sample's here and you're going into the grain interior in that direction. The melt deposits range in thickness from about 100 nanometers to over 5 microns. And that measurement's very important because the optical depth, or how much of the sample is actually interacting with light of different wavelengths, could be entirely melt deposit at this point. So these are actually creating the most important effects on what we're seeing in our spectral or optical characteristics from our remote sensing observations. And we also see these bright phases, these circular features that are distributed throughout the melt. We need to know what their composition is to try and understand how they might be influencing the changes in spectral properties we see for Bennu. So we can use our chemical mapping tools or energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy to see what the distribution of different elements are and to get quantitative compositional information about those phases. What we see that instead of iron metal, which is what we predominantly have observed in the lunar record for space-weathered samples, we see iron sulfides, some that include nickel within those particles as well. And the nickel is very heterogeneously distributed. It's not across the entire nanophase themselves. This is very important because what kinds of effects do these iron-nickel sulfides have on the spectral characteristics of a material? And then how does the size of these different components influence that spectral change? These are some high-resolution transmission electron microscopy images. So if you note the scale bar, we're down in the 10 nanometer range, so that's 10 to the negative 9 meters. Each of these parallel lines, these are atomic planes within the crystal structure of the sample. And what we see when we measure the spacing of those planes is that different mineral phases are occurring within 10 nanometers of each other. This is the first instance that we see these polyphasic or multi-mineralic nanophases within space-weathered samples, and are expecting that that's going to have some unique or different effect on the spectral characteristics of the asteroid. And as luck would have it, before samples were brought back from the OSIRIS-REx mission, I did some work in the laboratory to simulate these processes with analog materials. So we had predicted that there were going to be some sulfide phases or iron sulfide minerals. And so we did some modeling to try and understand or predict what the effect that these nanophases would have on the spectral characteristics of these compositions. One thing we found was that if we had nanoparticles that are over about 40 nanometers in diameter, which a lot of the population of these nanophases for Bennu belong to, we actually see a spectral bluing, meaning decreasing reflectance with increasing wavelength, like is visible in the purple line there, compared to our more traditional reddening, where we see, which is the effect we see for smaller particles. So this is likely, these large iron sulfide nanoparticles are likely what's driving the optical characteristics for asteroid Bennu. These tiny little particles are making the whole asteroid appear blue. We didn't just look for evidence of micrometeorite impacts, though. We also explored our evidence for solar wind irradiation. It was much harder to find that in samples from Bennu than it was in samples from the moon. But one area that we targeted were these bubbles or vesicles that we thought were a result of the accumulation of those solar wind species. So again, a cross-section, and we see these dark areas, which are bubbles, at the interface between the melt deposit and everything that's going on in the bulk of the sample. We're able to use specialized imaging techniques within the transmission electron microscope to see which of these bubbles are perforated, which are still intact that might be containing those solar wind species, and try and measure the presence of those different components. So we used our electron energy loss spectroscopy, or EELS technique, to investigate these bubbles shown in the gold and the red spectral lines. And then we also looked in areas that we thought were just irradiated by the solar wind without the vesicles developing. You'll see that there's a peak around 22 on the chart showing on the x-axis that's superimposed on this larger hump. That is a result of solar wind helium that we directly detected in situ for the first time in these samples from asteroid Bennu, and gave us more evidence for their exposure to these space weathering processes. Now, in addition to the solar wind species, we can also use the interaction with these surface materials with solar flares or solar energetic particles that come off the sun in solar flares to understand how long these grains have sat at the surface. So you can see an example of one of these particles here, and all these straight lines, these crisscrossing lines, are a result of the ionizing radiation damage from those solar flare particles. We can literally count the density, and this production function has been calibrated for lunar samples, and that can tell us how long this grain sat at the surface of asteroid Bennu relative to our calibration curve. And for these samples, all of the individual grains that we've measured so far, the timeline for that resonance on Bennu is about 45,000 years, which, if you remember, fits very comfortably between our bracketed ages that we obtain for the density of microcraters spread across the surface of some of those individual Bennu particles. So we might have our answer. Why is Bennu blue? Well, it's blue because it has these unique nanophase compositions that have nanoparticles in a size range that are likely driving these changes in a particular spectral direction compared to what we see for the lunar case. And we also have understanding of what the time scale for that spectral change is, because we know how long those grains have been sitting exposed at the surface. And it's on the order of tens of thousands of years that we're driving changes from the individual spectral characteristics of the asteroid towards this blue state. This is very interesting because while this was NASA's first asteroid sample return mission, it wasn't the only asteroid sample return mission. The Japanese Space Agency brought back samples from an asteroid called Ryugu. Samples from Ryugu are red. They have very similar space weathering characteristics, but the difference is the size of those nanoparticles and how long those grains have been sitting at the surface of the asteroid. So this allowed us to develop a model for, instead of diverging spectral trends, Ryugu gets red, Bennu gets blue, instead we start developing small nanophases that make the surface red, and as they are exposed for longer and longer timescales, we start to build up and develop larger nanophases, and that transitions towards a bluing effect. So instead of diverging trends, we're all in one cycle where we start at reddening and eventually move to bluing. So this is the value of having sample return missions from multiple different asteroids or planetary bodies. It can give you a more complete view of what is occurring with these processes across the solar system rather than just singular data points. So if you're interested in understanding more about what the record for our surface exposure on asteroid Bennu looks like, I encourage you to check out a paper that was published earlier this year in Nature, and it talks Nature Geoscience. It talks in a lot more detail about all of the different microstructural and chemical characteristics as a result of the surface exposure on Bennu. So what are the implications for this? What does this mean, and what does it tell us not only about origins of carbonaceous asteroids, but also how they have evolved over the last 4.5 billion years? Well, first, we know that the composition of Bennu, which is hydrated minerals, these minerals representative of the evaporate sequence, as well as complex organics, including some of these precursors to life, give us all the ingredients and the environments that could have been hospitable to develop these building blocks for delivery to an early Earth. This is particularly important because while we have carbonaceous meteorite samples here on Earth, as soon as they enter through Earth's atmosphere, they're completely contaminated by the organics, the life around you. This planet is teeming with life. So going out and getting these samples from the asteroid, bringing them back in very controlled conditions is the only way to be sure that we have an accurate inventory of what those organics were like in the early solar system. We found evidence for surface exposure, mostly dominated by micrometeorite impacts, and these processes are driving really rapid for solar system timescales, still tens of thousands of years, spectral changes to the surfaces of these planetary bodies. The nanoparticle mineralogies that they're producing are unique. It's not like anything we've seen in other return sample collections. And that's what's driving these differences in the spectral changes for carbonaceous asteroids compared to some of our lunar or other asteroidal counterpoints. There are differences in surface exposure timescale between samples from Bennu and other samples returned from carbonaceous asteroids that are showing us or demonstrating to us that there's a pathway or a cycle of space weathering that's occurring in the solar system. And this can be very helpful because it could be a metric that we could use to determine relative ages for these asteroids out in the main belt. As I said, these are among the most common asteroid types in the main belt within the solar system, and understanding what their diversity is and how their ages relative to one another is very important. So all of this is from one NASA mission, which was an incredible experience and gives us information from one particular planetary body. But my group and our department overall is really trying to build a model for this weathering across the solar system, everywhere from Mercury to Venus, the Moon, and then a series of different near-Earth asteroids. And that includes involvement in past, present, and future exploration missions, and has really been an incredible opportunity to work not only across the solar system, but to build up the careers and train some of the most amazing future planetary scientists that we have in our program here at Purdue. So I just want to finish with what my favorite quote, which I think is uniquely applicable to the research that I do, but where the telescope ends, the microscope begins. Which of the two has the grander view? And I feel very fortunate to have the opportunity to look on both sides of that. And I want to thank my amazing colleagues in EAPS and the College of Science, and in particularly my research group and all my students and postdocs. None of this would be possible without you. And then to the entire sample analysis team and NASA Curation for making the OSIRIS-REx mission possible. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Michelle. It's so fascinating talk. Let's open the floor.
Lots of questions. I don't understand how Veritas fits in space weather. Can you explain that?
So we're looking more broadly at surface weathering. So one of my students is Scott, who's actually here. He's working on analog samples that we think would be found at the surface of Venus, and they have been exposed in the GEAR chamber, which is a simulation chamber that replicates the Venus atmosphere. So instead of space weathering processes, we're looking at atmospheric surface interactions to see what kinds of weathering products are developing on those samples, and then how that might be relevant to remote sensing observations that could be made for Venus exploration missions. So I went from airless bodies to like maximum atmosphere body, but a little diversity there.
You mentioned at the beginning, you're a scientist and field actor. So is there a difference to use this material for construction, for example, if we wanted to?
Great question. So these materials I do not think would be very good. They're extremely soft, very friable. I always say if you look at it wrong, like it might break in half. But there's a lot of work going on that for building a sustained presence on the lunar surface. So there's groups here at Purdue and some that we're collaborating with that are trying to understand how can we build sustainable materials that could be used to construct habitats, that could be used to construct all kinds of things on the lunar surface. And that is a really emerging field, I would say. For these planetary materials, I think they've more been the target of what kinds of resources could we extract from them. So I mentioned that there's water as part of the crystal structure for some of these minerals. That's a very important resource when you're out exploring the solar system, can be used in a lot of different ways. And so understanding how much water there is, how could we get it out, is probably a more interesting target for samples from Bennu. But for the moon, absolutely, we're trying to build stuff out of lunar soil. Yeah, Roger.
Why is sulfides instead of nanophase iron?
That's a great question. The simple answer, I think, is because the sulfur is available and very volatile, so very prone to reacting. Also on the moon, we're in a very low oxygen environment. Here on the surface of Bennu, we have these mineral components that have water in them. It's creating more of an oxidizing environment, so we're less likely to see that very reduced iron metal. And in fact, we haven't actually found any metallic iron nanoparticles in the Bennu samples at all. So the differences in the composition, bulk composition of the sample really play a role in how they're experiencing those space weathering processes.
I got a question about that slide where you're pointing out the white spots and it had all the red stuff
Yeah.
on the in the lower right.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm more interested in what's going on in the images in the top.
This slide?
No,
Whatever.
it's there was 3 images, I think,
Okay.
with white spots.
White
And
spots.
I can't tell if it was after this.
Okay.
Probably after this.
Okay.
And then it had the really bright red ones in the lower right.
Okay. I'll keep scrolling. Maybe you can ask your question while I'm looking for it. Oh, okay. Yeah, absolutely. This one?
Yes.
Perfect. Good job,
I'm more
Daryl.
interested in what's going on in the structures on that upper right one. It almost looks like, if I were to just guess it, it's a burnt charcoal kind of looking thing.
Absolutely. When we got these samples back, it was the majority of them, even in this image here, it looks like what you would pull out of your barbecue, right, at the end of a grill session. Everything looks really dark until you go down into the fine scale. And that image in the upper right is particularly important because it shows you how it's not really within the integrity of the sample. It's sitting on these particles as a crust or as a vein kind of at the surface. These minerals are very easy to flake off. If you touch them, with your tweezers or something, they're removing themselves from the surface of the sample. And that was an important observation because we don't necessarily see each of these minerals in our remote sensing observations. So we had the spacecraft in orbit for 2 years around Bennu trying to understand what the composition was, what the minerals were. And some of these we found, but a lot of them we didn't. And we're chalking that up to them just being so friable, they're so not robust that they could be preferentially destroyed during things like impact events, during the thermal fatigue that's going on the surface of the asteroid. And so it was an interesting observation and maybe why we missed some of these minerals in the remote sensing phase. They're also not, I will say they're not on every single particle. We do see that they might be associated with some particular grain shapes, which I didn't talk a lot about today, but could have something to do with where we see the concentration of those phases.
Jill, thanks for a wonderful presentation. And sort of a related question in terms of when you're looking at sort of the zonation of these mineral phases, is there a clear picture that's sort of developing or a lot of unanswered questions as far as the particular mineral species that you're seeing, and is there a model that sort of makes sense related to that? And then you mentioned hydrated minerals. What are they?
Yeah, so there's a couple of answers to that. The first one is that we are trying to link what we're seeing at the grain scale to some observations of boulders and rock types from the orbital phase. So we've actually separated the kind of shapes or morphologies to these particles into different categories. We have some that are angular, very blocky. We have some that are hummocky, that have this really rough sort of surface texture. And they seem, as we're still continuing the analysis, but they do seem to be linked to what differences in composition have. So we're seeing much more of these carbonate and evaporite sequences in the hummocky samples compared to the angular samples. What that means about, there's all kinds of analysis going on about their mechanical strength, about what that could mean about their position within the asteroid, on its parent body. I wouldn't say we've completely solved that picture, but we're starting to try and untangle what those linkages are. For our hydrated minerals, I would say a huge proportion, about 80% of the mineral itself, or of the sample itself, are composed of phyllosilicates. We see things like saponite. We see, we haven't found any trichylinite, but mostly a lot of saponite, chrysotile, those kinds of minerals. Yeah.
Did you see hydrides?
Hydrides?
Talked quite a bit about water being there, but then when you say hydrated, that's minerals containing water molecules rather than hydrides being formed.
Yes.
Have folks or yourself, have you asked the question why hydrides are not formed and why hydrides would not exist in a stable manner?
Yeah, we haven't found any evidence for hydrides specifically. This water, you think about what's going on in Bennu, you might be imagining, oh, there's like pools or ponds of water, but that's not stable in a space environment, right? So you're more thinking about these kind of pockets of mud in the interior of the asteroid is how we define something that is hydrated. We are looking for other potential traps for this water that is maybe not within the crystal structure itself. So I showed the one example for the helium that we found in those bubbles. But another way we can form bubbles outside of solar wind irradiation is through melting material that liberates a lot of volatile species during that heating event. And so we think that some of this water could be trapped, liberated from the actual crystal structure, and contained within the vesicles or bubbles themselves. So that's one area we're looking for. And then something I didn't present, but there are some very limited examples of these nanophases themselves seemingly looking like they might have an alteration rind on them. So where water that's contained within the glass that's produced in those impact events could be altering the outer composition of the nanophases themselves. So those are some areas where we're looking for what other place could this water be now.
Great talk, Michelle. So actually looking at this slide, I see dolomite, which we don't even understand how it's made on Earth. But presumably it comes from substitution of magnesium into calcite. How will you produce it in space?
Great question, Doug. Don't have an answer for you. I would point you towards our evaporite sequence paper, where I think they have proposed some mechanisms, but there's just, kind of related to the last question, we don't have a lot of constraints about what does this environment actually look like. We know, okay, there must have been fluids because you can't get these kinds of phases without fluids. We have an idea of what their composition might be, but what's really going on is very poorly constrained. And it's hard to replicate these kinds of scenarios, certainly not on Earth because you're in a completely different environment, but even in a laboratory setting where you're trying to simulate it. So I wouldn't say that we have any of that figured out. It was more, let's just point towards, we know this process is happening. Yeah, Arch.
Is there a way to get a core out of these asteroids?
So based on our sampling, I would say that probably would not be particularly successful. We're really working in an extreme microgravity environment. So while they did a lot of tests with the tag SAM and the sampling mechanism before flight, because they wanted to make sure that it worked, there's not a lot of understanding of what the regolith or the soil cohesion even looks like in these microgravity environments. How tightly bound is the material to the surface? And it turns out from this, not nearly as cohesive as we actually thought it was. And so we have not yet, NASA has not yet put a lander onto an asteroid, but any sort of force that you would need to try and like drill or core, you know, you're working in such a microgravity environment, I don't think that's going to be particularly successful. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Andrew.
So you use the solar wind to look at the striations to figure out the age of the asteroid?
Yes.
How do you calibrate that?
Great question. So the solar flare tracks, this is what you're referring to, right? This is all calibrated for lunar samples, where we have a rock that we know was sitting exposed on the moon. We can date that with other techniques and then use the solar flare tracks to calibrate it. There is some uncertainty because all of this is, this and the crater density are all relative to the moon. And while Bennu is in lunar-ish space, it's in near-Earth space, its history and how long it's spent in that environment and how different its exposure history would be for both solar flare particles as well as impacts is not very well constrained. And so we're using this as our first kind of base level, but all of that is constrained from the moon, where we have samples that we can date with other techniques as well. Yeah.
Let me follow up with that. The 45-ish thousand years seems like a really young age, and I'm curious. I mean, asteroids can be disrupted over time. The asteroid belt is near Earth, so it's not really the main asteroid belt. And so is the age representative of something else besides a disturbance, or what is it representing?
Yeah, so it's important to think that all of these processes are occurring in the upper couple millimeters. So this gives us a constraint on how long this particle sat in the upper, let's say, 2 millimeters of the surface. You say it's pretty young, but compared to asteroid Ryugu, which was the target of the JAXA Hayabusa 2 mission, we're actually an order of magnitude longer. Yes, and then Itokawa, which is our third asteroid that we have samples returned from, is one order of magnitude longer than this. So we're seeing that there's a diversity in terms of the time scales across the asteroids, and they all have different spectral characteristics. So trying to link that cycle is kind of an important thing that we're going to work on moving forward over the next however many decades of my career. Yes. It could be anything from a large like mass movement, mass wasting event that is refreshing large portions of the surface, down to this grain was just gardened below a few millimeters by a smaller impact.
Well, thank you very much. It's been fascinating talk. Very proud of your work, Michelle, and the work of all the EAPS colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I leave my bag here?